Hello again. So what I thought I'd do, since I gave you both a short story and I guess a portfolio of poetry to think about as we think about our first topic of the term, and that is, what is classic literature, or why do we read literature? Why does it matter? Though since the last video dealt with Chopin's story of an hour, I thought I'd go ahead and do a little bit about poetry, because I know poetry can be especially intimidating. I know one of the things when I was younger, even in college, becoming an English major, that I did not like about poetry, and the reason I resisted it was that it made me feel stupid. I couldn't see things that I was supposed to see. So obviously I've learned to outgrow that a little bit. I still feel that way with certain poets, but I think it's important to understand the role that poetry, especially good poetry, can and should play as we read literature. Poetry works differently, as we can tell here, than fiction, than novels, than drama. We'll read drama later. But I thought I'd start with a really simple yet very complicated poem. One of my favorites, by Ezra Pound, in A Station of the Metro. I had you read this today, and I looked at your discussion posts, and it seemed to me that some of you were going outside of the text, which I said is perfectly fine, but only one of you who seemed to offer something that used pretty sophisticated language to explain the poem cited it. So I want to just reiterate what I said in the discussion posts at the notes at the top, and that is, you are not required to go outside of the text to respond to these texts unless you're explicitly asked to. But if you do, you have to cite it. Otherwise, that's plagiarism. So I just want to reiterate that. All right, so I want to talk a little bit about what makes this poem both a good poem and what makes this classic literature. First of all, good poetry. I think we sometimes think good poetry makes us feel. And that might be the case, but from my perspective, good poems like this poem deal in the specific rather than the abstract. And I'll give you an example here. We have two lines. The apparition of these faces in the crowd. Petals on a wet black bough. That's it. That's the entire poem. You might say, well, this is too simple to mean anything. But it means because of its simplicity. I'll get into that. Okay, so the first way is language and image. So let's look at some of the language and some of the imagery. The very first line, the apparition. What is an apparition? This poem invites us to translate it, that is, to interact with it and ask questions. What is an apparition and why apparition? It seems weird that we have apparition connected to faces in the crowd. Why apparition? Ghost-like, ephemeral. All right? It does make us feel, but it only makes us feel if we think about it. That is, if we define these terms and ask questions. And this is what we mean when we say interrogate. Okay, the second part, faces in the crowd. It's an interesting concept, right? Faces in the crowd. Why a crowd? Why not individual faces? So again, we're being asked through the language choice, the specific details. Okay, and the second one then, petals on a wet black bough. Petals. All right, obviously why? Why petals? Why specific petals? Is there a relationship between petals and faces, for instance? Why not leaves? Why petals? Okay, petals are different than leaves. Why is the bough? Why is it a bough? Why not a tree? All right, what is a bough versus a tree? And why is it wet? All right, what are we supposed to get from it being wet? So in some ways, the language and the specific details are asking us to interrogate it. And I think we get a lot from it, even just in these two simple lines by doing that. Okay, number 2, juxtaposition. Oftentimes, poetry is very, very good at this. We talked about this. I talked about this a little bit with Story of an Hour, juxtaposition in terms of irony, asking you to think about 2 different ways a heart can mean, placing them together and asking you to think about the relationship between those two. Poetry works juxtaposition also. So what we have is we have the juxtaposition of the first line placed on top of the juxtaposition, or the second line. We have juxtaposition of the 2 images being placed next to each other. We are being asked, right? In this instance, that's called a metaphor, when it's being suggested or you have to infer it. If the comparison is being direct, it's not a metaphor. But here we're being asked to see these 2 things as existing together, and through comparison understand each better, but also the 2 together. Okay, so in this juxtaposition, it creates tension. What are the tone? What's the tone of the first line? What's the tone of the second line? What are the images? Right? What is the apparition of the faces in the crowd? Where is that existing? The petals on a wet black bough. Where is that existing? There is contrast. There is tension between these 2 things. And then finally, what is the theme of both each line, but then also placing them both together? Okay, so obviously meaning through juxtaposition. That's something that can only occur when we do some sort of comparison. And another thing with poetry is we have to think of rhyme and rhythm. Now, a lot of times people think poetry has to rhyme. This poem actually does rhyme. It's called a slant rhyme. Right? Look at the last word of each crowd bow. Right? It rhymes in sound, that thus calling a relationship to each other. This is a 19-syllable poem. 12 syllables in the first, 7 syllables in the second. That's it. Very, very simple. There is, however, still a simplicity in the language. And it does have a rhythm to it. The apparition of these faces in the crowd. Petals on a wet black bough. Right? You can hear it. It's sort of sing-songy. So it doesn't have to have iambic pentameter. It doesn't have to be the Plutarchian, right, sonnet. It doesn't have to be A, B, A, B, C, D, C, D, E, F, E, F, G, G. It doesn't have to have rhyme or rhythm scheme like that for it to be a good poem. But the language, the words are placed next to each other in such a way that it suggests meaning as well through the way. Poetry is meant to be heard, and when you read it aloud, you get that. Okay, so obviously this has both rhythm and it has rhyme. And then finally, poetry, I think, asks us to think about the speaker. Okay, we talked a little bit about the narrator or point of view in Story of an Hour, the third person omniscient. Poems have speakers, and I think that the fact that they have speakers suggests what I said earlier, and that is that they're meant to be heard. Right? Poetry sounds differently when you read it aloud than when you just read it in your head. And that speaker is a construction of the author. It's not necessarily the poet or the author, just like the narrator in a short story or in a novel. A speaker is a construct of the poet to tell a story. Here, the story is a poem, right? And so we have to think about that as well. So who is speaking this poem? Who's speaking these lines? Where is it occurring? All right, obviously, it's in a station of the metro, which is the title. We have to think about that. The title itself is sometimes part of the poem, as A Story of an Hour may be part of a short story here. You get some things from the title that you wouldn't about setting. What is the significance of where it takes place and who's speaking the lines, right? So the fact that it is in a train station, that's what a station of a metro means. Why is that significant? Right? What happens at train stations? People are coming and going. They're not. Where are they going to? Where are they coming from? So this idea of a crossroads, we'll see that a little bit in the next story, Hills Like White Elephants, which also takes place at a train station. You'll see that poets and writers like to think about train stations, places of passing, places of crossing, places of choice. It's very philosophical. Is the speaker a passenger on the train? What would suggest that he is? Or is the speaker an observer outside of the train? That is, perhaps sitting on a bench somewhere, watching people on a train, looking around and seeing what's not on the train. I think the poem suggests that the speaker is not, in fact, a current passenger. This person has been a passenger, right? Knows what it means to be a passenger on the train, but this person may be sitting waiting for a train. All right, think about it. Look at the first line, the apparition of these faces in the crowd. Well, if we read that literally, it means the trains are coming, and he's looking up, and what he sees the faces in the crowd, right, going by. Or, right, one could say, well, he's on the train, and what he sees is the people waiting for the train. So either way, I think what you have is movement. You have the speakers either stationary or moving, and the thing that he's witnessing. Now, the reason I think that he may be waiting for a train is the second line, and that is petals on a wet black bough. He seems to be able to see without it moving the tree. If he was on the train, he wouldn't be able to see the tree not moving. So, but sitting there waiting, he can turn and look and see a tree. This tree has a bough or a main limb. On that limb are flowers, the petals on flowers. They're on a wet black bough, right? It's been sitting there. It's not moving. He sees that, right? So anyway, again, what you have from speaker and setting and tone and language and image is juxtaposition. And this poem specifically works because of juxtaposition. Now we can start talking about why. What does it all mean? What is the theme, etc.? And I think some of you got at that in your reading responses. What is happening in 1924, 26, when this poem is written? What sort of cultural events are occurring in the 20s? Why would a train station juxtaposed with people taking train rides being juxtaposed with nature? Why would that be something that's interesting? Is it now? Right? This poem's asking us to think about the relationship between technology and our lives as mediated through technology, that fast-paced work life, and our ability to appreciate things that are standing still. Nature, our children, whatever, family. So it asks us to think that. And then again, if we go back to Calvino's 14 criteria of what made classic literature, there is some universal questions that are being asked. Is it worth it? Is it worth it? What are we missing in this bustle of busy life? Like, you're college students right now. You're all in the middle of this question yourselves, and that is, think about every day of your life. You are running the class. You are frantically studying, taking notes, writing. You're just working everything in to your life. Okay? Is it worth it? Of course it's worth it. But is something missing too? That is, can we balance that? What is the purpose? What is the goal? All right, the mission of the university. We can connect it to the mission of the university. Students are expected to. The mission of the university is for students to find fulfilling lives, to engage in meaningful work, and to be responsible citizens. And I think the goal or the trek becomes the focus rather than the mission itself. And can we enjoy that mission without being reflective? So in some ways, the nature of the reflective beast is being asked here as well. So what I'd like you to do is, number one, to think about how poetry works different. Go back into your responses. Think about how your responses to William Carlos Williams' poetry. Again, very, very simple seeming, is it? And so that's something. Number two, remember, it is okay to go outside of the text to offer interpretations. But when you do so, I expect you to cite your sources, okay? For a variety of reasons. Number one, it's plagiarism if you don't. That is, you're claiming other people's ideas as your own. Can't do that. That's academic fraud. Number two, it's not bad to use others' ideas and voices to extend your own, right? To extend your own, okay? That's part of what we do in college. It's perfectly acceptable. But you have to use credible sources. You can't just go on to schmoop.com and say schmoop.com says. So that's another reason I want you to cite your sources, because I want to be able to help you as a teacher figure out how to find credible sources to ask good questions about that. You're going to have to do that in your writing, for your essays. So if you're doing that for your reading responses, perfectly fine. I just need you to cite those things. Hope you learned. I'll see you soon, and good luck with the readings for Thursday. If you need anything, ask. I'm here. Thanks a lot. Bye.